Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Well, Kohei Horikoshi's landmark work, My Hero Academia, just ended a couple of weeks ago. And the ending to the series has been a mixed bag, for sure. And there's been a lot of commentary on it, of a variety of different flavors. I'm here to add my own thoughts to it after having some time to mull over what I read and kind of think about not just what I thought about it, but what I was seeing from some other people. Anyone who's followed shonen stories for a long time knows that it's very difficult to stick the ending to them. A shonen story is very much about coming of age and of testing yourself against all kinds of different obstacles, and eventually, that is something you kind of have to set aside as you devote yourself not so much to improving yourself, but on improving the world around you. And whether or not that part of real life is an aspect of the ending in a shonen story is very much up to the person who writes it. Many shonen stories just sort of leave it out, and they show the character continuing on in their self-improvement, in their mastery of their chosen field, and perhaps giving some hints of where that will take them in the future. A perfect example of this is iShield 21, a series that was about an American football player who graduates from high school and winds up leaving his team and joining a university team, and instead of continuing onwards to play football with the teammates he developed over the course of the story, they wind up at different colleges on different teams and looking forward to playing against each other. It's a pretty good continuing to grow kind of ending for a shonen series. Other shonen series try and give you an idea of what characters are going to look like once they have mastered their chosen skill sets and gone out into the world to make it a place more in line with their visions as they are laid out over the course of the story. You saw that in Bleach, and you saw it also in Naruto. Both of these were stories where the character at the end of the story is shown to us as an adult in the form that they had always aspired to, with their family and friends around them, and that was clearly the kind of ending that Horikoshi was going with for My Hero Academia. And that is a much more risky kind of an ending to shoot for, because it requires you to actually put down some ending points for your characters, rather than showing them continuing on a journey that your audience already loved. So I'm not surprised that people found it a bit controversial. I do think a lot of the critiques of it are things that are a little bit misplaced. I'm going to discuss that at some length today. But before I do that, let me just make an obligatory spoiler warning here. Yes, I'm discussing the end of a series, so there's going to be some spoilers here. Also, I feel like I should make a disclaimer here. What kind of ending you like for a story is a matter of personal taste, as is, of course, the kinds of stories you choose to read in the first place. And I know that a lot of people said they didn't like My Hero Academia's ending because it didn't sit well with them, it was disappointing to them, and I saw several people who said they had dropped the series because late in the series, Horikoshi took the story in a direction radically different from the early parts of the story. It ceased to be a fun coming-of-age story about kids who are finding their place in the world, and it became about this vast, era-defining civil war in the quirk-driven society. All well and good. These are matters of personal taste. I can't really hold anyone's tastes against them, unless you like pineapple pizza, in which case, get out. But I really don't think personal taste is something you can argue a person into or out of. If they just didn't have a taste for the story, they don't have a taste for the story. There are plenty of good stories out there which I have no desire to really get into. Berserk and Attack on Titan, I followed for a little bit, and I was like, this really isn't hitting for me, and so I dropped both of those series, even though I could tell there was a lot of very good storytelling going on in them, from the perspective of craftsmanship, at least. The thing is, there's a ton of really well-built stories out there that you can enjoy. If one isn't landing for you, okay, move on, find the next one and enjoy that. Really, what I want to talk about is critiques that are being made of the story which don't see the story for what it is. And I'm going to get to that, but first, I want to make my own critiques of the ending, because it's not a perfect ending. It's not even, I think, a good ending. It's just average at best. And to be perfectly honest, as a Hero Aka enjoyer, that's what the story is. It is a perfectly middle-of-the-road shonen story, focusing on superheroes and engaging characters over really solid world building and intricate plots. So on the one hand, this ending was about what I was expecting. Horikoshi has really, really strong draftsmanship and a good sense of how to make appealing character designs, and he is a very Workman-like storyteller. I expected a Workman-like ending, and that's what I got. As a whole, the Quirk Society Civil War was kind of a slow slog through the entirety of the MHA universe that didn't really serve a lot of the characters very well. It had poor pacing. A lot of characters that are introduced in the middle of the story don't really get a whole lot of resolution to the ideas they bring up, particularly Class 2 in the Hero program. We almost never see them again, even though they are an interesting foil to Class 1. And the last, say, 5 or 6 chapters after Shigaraki and All for One are out of the picture, they put their emphasis in some strange places. I know that Aizawa was a fan favorite character, but I really felt like focusing so much on him and present Mike and Kurogiri was a bit of a waste of time that could have been spent on some of the more central characters who really drove the class dynamics and the story. In particular, Ida and Bakugo get almost no resolution to their characters in the last few chapters, and I feel that's a tragedy. They were central to Deku's early character development and into really shaping him into the character he is for most of the story, and to have no resolution for them, kind of a disappointment. I know that Ida really didn't have any major character arc to go through. Even when he got tangled up in the hero killer incident, he didn't change a whole lot. That's admittedly a big part of his appeal. He is a steady, dependable, reliable character who's always going to be there doing what he does. I still would have liked to get a little bit more of him in the resolution. Yes, since he is so predictable, it's pretty easy to guess what he was doing in all that time, but one of the nice things about him is that he's there and reliable, and he wasn't there or reliable in those last few chapters, except for when introducing, the next class of students, another place where I feel like Horikoshi invested some time that didn't really lead anywhere. Yes, showing that Deku and Class 1A are fulfilling that role as the symbol of peace. I think one of the big things he was going for, especially in the second half of the story, was showing that Deku had transformed the legacy of All Might from being a singular symbol of peace to an entire generation of peace. An entire society that takes up the burdens All Might was carrying and makes them a core pillar of what defines that society. Rather than passively relying on a single person to always be there to save them, they begin to transform the world so that they are ready to build up a society where saving people is less necessary. So showing that this particular class from UA High School is ready to step into that role is kind of a part of showing that legacy being handed down, but we didn't need pages and pages of it. I think it could have been handled in maybe 2 or 3 panels scattered throughout the rest of this resolution. Show us the new students, show us them treating Deku very respectfully, maybe show him being bashful about it because that's his character, and move on. We didn't need a bunch of dialogue, a bunch of names. It was excessive. What I did feel was handled pretty well was the resolution of the Todoroki family and Urara. In particular, the Todorokis have a very believable and bittersweet resolution to their story. Endeavor has to retire. The Todorokis, they never really come back together as a family, as we shouldn't really expect them to. Endeavor did a pretty good job burning his bridges. But he also made a good faith effort to make restitution for that. And he has freed his family from the shadow he cast over them. What he did to his children was not by any stretch of the imagination a good thing, but a lesser man would have left the damage he caused them in place and never tried to lift them above it at all. And I think we did see Endeavor make good faith efforts to at least set his children free of the terrible expectations he put on them. Shoto, at least, is well positioned to do that. Now, Ochako is a little more complicated. She clearly had a very fraught relationship with Togo, and Togo's death to save her life clearly caused her some trauma. That's a heavy storyline. Horikoshi let it breathe, and then he brought Deku and the rest of Class 1A in to build her up after that. Deku shows up first because he has the embers of All for One, and because he is the person who is driven to help those in need. That's his first beat with Aurora, and that's his last beat with her as well. It brings the relationship full circle in a way that I think is pretty good. It could be read as an indication that the relationship will maintain its status quo, or it could be read as an indication that the relationship will continue on its current trajectory, and eventually they will blossom from simple schoolmates into a romantic attachment. My interpretation of it was the latter, but I recognize that it is by no means clear-cut. I think that's understandable given the nature of the story, and I'm going to address that some more in a bit, but I personally didn't have a problem with it. Finally, the resolution of Deku's relationship with All Might is also very on point, in my opinion. Deku is, through the entire story, following in the footsteps of All Might, his personal hero, and the legacy of One for All. The relationship between All Might and Deku is the core relationship in My Hero Academia. Deku is not studying to grow into a generic hero. He is studying to grow into his personal hero. That's why the title is My Hero Academia. So we really shouldn't be surprised that we see Deku go through pretty much every beat of growth that All Might goes through, except with the benefit of All Might as a mentor, he does not suffer as much damage and as much blowback as All Might does. So, being born quirkless, receiving a quirk, One for All, due to its ability to be passed from one person to another, fighting All for One, suffering lifelong scars in the battle, giving up One for All, and ultimately finding a mechanical adaptation that allows him to continue his work after the last embers of One for All go out. These are all beats that are laid down by All Might. These are all beats that Deku follows in the footsteps with. It emphasizes how alike they are as characters, how they shared the same goals, and how much like the quirk they shared, each of them is building on what is given them by their predecessors to make something a little bit better for the next generation. I like these themes, I like the way they carry out through the entirety of the story, and I like the honesty of showing that the great work that Deku does in his life also comes with some consequences for him. He does have to give up and sacrifice a lot in order to carry through the heroic actions he aspires to. I think that's part of heroism. Now, helping a person who's in need at no cost to yourself is still admirable behavior, but heroism comes with a notion of self-sacrifice baked into it. And I think actually showing Deku making these sacrifices, losing some of the time he could have been spending as a professional hero doing what he really loves, is an important part of his character arc. And again, it is Deku following in the footsteps of All Might, who sacrificed part of his career as a professional hero so he could pass on his quirk to Deku. I know that getting into the nitty-gritty of these kinds of things, seeing that people do have to suffer and sometimes spend a great deal of time in the wilderness for doing the heroic things that life demands of them, is not the most satisfying storytelling for some people. It's not really wish fulfillment. So if you're going to say, I don't like the story for that reason, okay, don't like the story for that reason. But I don't think Horikoshi set out to do a wish fulfillment story either, so I don't have a problem with it. So yeah, pretty good storytelling. Not great. I think about 10 years from now, My Hero Academia will be looked back on much like, say, Bleach was, a series that had really great art and an okay story behind it, but that ultimately doesn't make that big of an impact on the landscape of the manga world going forward. It's not a bad place to be. Horikoshi probably has another couple of big series in him at the rate he's going, so if he can really refine his storytelling techniques and couple that with the excellence he's developed in his artistic abilities, I'm sure we have a great, great shonen story somewhere in the future to look forward to. I just don't think My Hero Academia was that story. So, not great story, not a poor story. With that said, let's talk about this. I've seen a lot of memes like this going around. A lot of people are dumping on the ending, and usually comparing it to endings they think are better. So, why do I bring this up? After all, I did say I'm not here to try and change the minds of people who just don't like the ending because it's not their cup of tea. Well, this is not just not liking an ending, this is a critique. And yes, it's probably a critique that's rooted in how much the ending was not to their taste, but it's still a critique. And it's not a very good one. If you've been around this channel for a while, you're aware that one of my mottos is that stories are specific, they are not general. What we have here is a broad and general set of critiques. And I'm going to discuss more than just what's in this meme, but this meme and the ones similar to it that I've seen on Discords and Facebooks and Twitters all over the place, they all carry a very similar idea to it. This ending is not like that ending, and so bad. That is very, very shoddy critique. If I wanted to be equally shoddy, I could just say, well, yes, the beginning of that story wasn't like the beginning of that story. Why do you expect the endings to be the same? But I'm here to be a little more specific. So, let's talk about some of the critiques I've heard and why I think they are bad critiques. Not all of those critiques are expressed in this meme. This is, again, just a stand-in for the kinds of bad critiques I want to talk about. So, critique number 1. Deku loses the powers he always dreamed to have. Right away, incorrect. Deku never desired to have powers. Deku desired to be a hero who could encourage people with his smile and his reassurance that he was there to help. The powers are what were necessary for him to do that. Yes, Deku wanted the ability to make a positive impact in the world, but he didn't necessarily have to have any specific quirk to do that. He just needed a quirk that would get him enough influence, enough prestige, and of course, enough actual physical power to make that impact on the world. By chapter 430 of My Hero Academia, Deku has that physical power again. He gets a power suit rather than just having a quirk. He also has a lot of experience, a lot of respect, a lot of allies. All of these things make it possible for him to continue fulfilling his dream, being a hero who saves people with a smile on his face, without having to have a quirk. In many ways, Deku is the first person, and likely to be the last person, to do this without having a quirk, because as we know, the prevalence of quirks in society is growing with every generation. By the same token, the critique that Ed never wanted his powers is silly. We see Ed and Alphonse doing alchemy from, the earliest ages that we actually see them, and they're able to do alchemy. I mean, they don't do it when they're babies, but from the moment they can open a book, they're tinkering around with alchemy. I don't know where this idea that Ed never wanted to be an alchemist comes from. It was as natural to them as breathing. And that brings me to another critique of Deku giving up his powers, which is that he earned his powers, he shouldn't have to give them up. Both of these statements are wrong in the text of the story. Deku does not earn his powers, at least not in the way people typically present it. People tend to say that Deku had to build himself up until he was worthy of the power. But that's not true. He had to build himself up until he could utilize the power. That is an accurate representation of what happened in the story, but he did not have to earn his power. Deku was naturally gifted in a way that made All Might choose him for the power. We are told in the first and final chapters of the story that real heroes, when they see someone in need, their bodies move before they have a chance to think. Deku naturally had that ability. And it was the fact that Deku demonstrated that without having any of the training or power necessary to back up that instinct that caused All Might to choose him as his successor. Now again, Deku had to learn to use what he was given, just like any other quirk user we see learning to master their quirks to a higher level at UA Academy. But did he earn his powers? No. They were a gift to him, a gift in recognition of his natural inclinations, in recognition of something he already was. Likewise, Deku having to give up his powers is a recognition of what One for All already was. It was not created to make superheroes. It was created to end the tyranny of All for One. It was the only thing left in the world that could really do that. And so, again, as I already said, it was necessary to make that sacrifice to end All for One's threat to the rest of the world. Horikoshi made it very clear throughout the course of his story that Deku was going to have to give up his powers, but he wasn't going to have to stop being a hero. We see that told to us many, many times. All Might doesn't retire when he loses his powers, but rather when he fulfills his duty to fight a final battle with All for One. And again, even after that, he finds a technological way to allow him to continue to take the field and do his duty one more time. I'm going to keep harping on this because the relationship between All Might and Deku is the core relationship in the story of My Hero Academia. It is the foundation upon which the entirety of the story is built, and the continuity between these two figures is vitally important to understanding both the beginning and the ending. Conversely, in Fullmetal Alchemist, the core relationship is not between a young man and his mentor. For that matter, Fullmetal Alchemist is not even really a coming-of-age story. It is a story of atonement, and the core relationship is not between Edward and a mentor figure, nor is it even between Edward and his brother Alphonse. The key relationship to understanding Fullmetal Alchemist is between Edward and his mother. Again, this is a relationship established at the very beginning of the story. Chapter 1, page 1, establishes that relationship and the philosophy that guides the entirety of the story. Much like Deku is working to become someone who can save people with a smile, Edward is attempting to grapple with the philosophy that humanity cannot gain anything without sacrificing something in return. Edward learns that lesson through his mother twice. First, in all the sacrifices that she makes on his behalf and on behalf of his brother, and second, when his attempt to bring her back to life using alchemy backfires and demands a price from him instead. From that moment forward, every time Ed looks at his missing arm or his missing leg or the empty suit of armor that is his brother, he is reminded of his shortcomings in understanding the lessons that his mother was trying to teach, namely, to sacrifice on behalf of others, to add a little bit to everyone that you meet. It is only when Edward understands this lesson that he is able to overturn the corrupt system in Amestris and go home and marry his girl. So, that brings us to the second major critique, one that we see even here on this list. Edward gets Winry because when a man grows up, he doesn't go back to his mother, he gets married himself. Ed settling down with Winry is an indication that he has understood and repaired the relationship that went asunder when his mother died. This is the core idea at the heart of Fullmetal Alchemist. It's what the entire story leads to. Conversely, in My Hero Academia, while she's important to Deku, Ochako is not the most important character to his goals, his ambitions, or the theme of the story. Again, that core relationship is Deku and All Might. So Fullmetal Alchemist dedicating a great deal of time to showing Edward and Winry's relationship at the end of the story is vital to putting a capstone on the story as a whole. Conversely, in My Hero Academia, the final chapter is going to put all of its emphasis on establishing the resolved relationship between All Might and Deku, rather than spending a lot of time showing his relationship with everyone else. So both the critique that Deku doesn't get the girl and the critique that his friends aren't around for 8 years has no merit. We don't know that, A, and B, it's not the goal of the story to show where those relationships are going to be in 8 years. It's the goal of the story to close the loop on the continuity between its two core characters, to show that Deku has fully followed in the footsteps of the man who was his goal throughout the entire story. I get that telling that story is not to the taste of a lot of people out there, but this kind of very lazy critique is really not doing any good service to either story. So those are my concluding thoughts on Horikoshi's work. I think it's pretty good. I think he fulfilled most of his own goals with the story, and did so in a way that is very respectable. I also think he still has a lot of improvement he could do as a storyteller, and I definitely hope this is not the last we hear from him. In the meantime, let me know what you think of the ending of My Hero Academia down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.